Hello everybody, my name is Ratnos, and today I wanted to make a video helping you figure out which anima powers you should take when playing against the Tormented affix. Now, quick explanation for those who didn't know, these anima powers are not random, they're not class specific, they are based on your role, which means that every single time you kill Sagadon the Breaker this season, if you're a DPS player, you will be offered the same choice. The Stone Ward, Dripping Fang, or Tiny Dancing Shoes. The entire time, all season, that will continue to be true. So you can figure out and plan in advance which of these are worth taking. Some are better than others. For instance, on Sagadon the Breaker, I would say that the Stone Ward for 95% of cases, for 95% of rolls, is the best choice. This is a nice shield, 20% of your maximum health. The Absorb refreshes every 45 seconds. It is a nice protection against one-shots and a solid amount of HPS on your character for the whole dungeon. I think it will get you more reliable value on a DPS player than Dripping Fang or Tiny Dancing Shoes. I would use it on a tank unless there's a specific reason you're looking for magic damage reduction, a specific boss that you are worried about magic damage on. And on a healer, I would also say that it's the most likely to help prevent deaths on you at random, unexpected times. However, if you're interested in an opinion for your class in particular, Wowhead has class guides for every spec in M+, and in each of those guides, you can find suggestions for which anima powers you want. So you just go down on the navigation here, click on the anima powers button, and you'll see some suggested powers here, including sometimes some discussion of which ones are going to be good for which reasons. So that's a good piece of advice in case you do have something different about the way your class operates with the average. For instance, some of them may function weirdly with pets, some of them may function weirdly at different ranges, some of them are hasted procs, which means that they will function differently for different classes on that front. So yeah, advice on Sagadon the Breaker, everybody takes Stone Ward is a solid default option unless you have a really strong reason you want something else. Incinerator Arcoleth, for DPS players, I think Champion's Brand is usually a solid pick. That's a lot of stats. Unlike Raging Battle Axe, which is a proc thing for things on low health, or Signet of Bullstring, which is pretty finicky and hard to set up, and pretty small percent damage increase there as well, given how much work you have to do to make this thing work. Champion's Brand, all it asks of you is to stay above 70% health, which is most of the dungeon, especially as a DPS player. For tanks, it's not a bad option either. But you'll be spending a lot less of the dungeon above 70% health, obviously, as you're getting attacked by stuff intentionally. The one that I think is a really solid all-around pick for tanks and that I would usually go for is Crumbling Bulwark. It's a 5% passive versatility increase, which is already a sizable defensive benefit. And upon entering combat, your damage taken is reduced by 40% for 4 seconds. This is really strong for tank specs that are especially vulnerable on pull. So, some tank specs, they need to set up some globals doing Marrow Rends or getting their Iron Furs up, and they're at their weakest right at the start of a pull. Crumbling Bulwark goes a long way towards making that less of a scary time. But if you want some more AoE damage, there is the Fifth Skull, which is the same as that Torghast one. As long as there are 5 or more enemies within 10 yards, it does a bunch of damage to every 5 seconds, to up to 5 enemies. So can be good, does require you to be pulling 5 or more enemies pretty frequently. I took this thing in Theater of Pain, and it did basically 0 damage. That dungeon does not have a lot of big pulls, but if you're in a dungeon where you can pull 5 or more enemies pretty reliably, this thing will contribute a non-trivial amount of damage. I would recommend the Crumbling Bulwark as a default for tanks, though. And then for healers, you have Champion's Brand, Sanguine Ichor, which has gotten nerfed a little bit since PTR, and the Pedestal of Utter Hubris, which is a haste increase, but you burn for 5% of your max health every 3 seconds. My understanding is this one is the most exciting stat-wise, but it does depend a little bit on which stats your healing spec likes. So again, go check out the guide for your healer spec in particular, and you may find that there are some different options, again, also depending on how much you like to get into melee, for instance, to make the Bottle of Sanguine Ichor work, because that does require you to be up close and personal with whatever you're hitting. Right, Aura's Cold Heart offers Regenerative Fungus. Taking damage heals you for 1.5% of your max health. Vial of Desperation, when you take 25% or more of your max health and damage from a single attack, you gain 50% movement speed and suffer 50% less damage for 3 seconds. And then the Handbook of Uncivil Etiquette, deal 10% increased damage to targets you successfully interrupt for 8 seconds. So this one's the only button you can click to increase your damage, and I know a lot of you DPS players have already tuned out now and are always going to be clicking on this one, but both of these actually have pretty solid uses. The Vial of Desperation, it's not going to prevent you from dying to 1-shots, but it's going to do a really good job of preventing you from dying to 2 shots. Very hard to die when you got a 50% damage reduction on you. So successive heavy, moderate incoming damage is something that this will be very solid against, a solid defensive option. The Regenerative Fungus is pretty small amount of healing. You can see it's got a cooldown there of half a second as well. But against Snaffics like Grievous, for instance, this sort of thing, assuming it procs off that, which not everything does. We haven't had a Grievous week yet, but if it does, I imagine this would be a good option on that week. For tanks, you have the Interrupt damage power. You have the Pendant of the Martyr, which is a 10% reduction against incoming AoE damage for yourself and all allies within 10 yards. Pretty small range, pretty small number, but could maybe be useful. And there's Huntsman's Horn, which is a 70% movement speed increase for 6 seconds upon entering combat. This can be really nice for grouping up enemies. If you're playing a class that's already pretty mobile, you're already like leaping in, charging in or whatever, you don't feel like you need this, you could take the damage increase of the Handbook of Uncivil Etiquette. The Pendant of the Martyr, it's rare that AoE damage is what threatens you as a tank, so I struggle to come up with a situation where this one's going to be all that useful, but if you feel like neither of these others are going to be particularly good, at least it's something, if minor. And then you have the healers on Aura's Coldheart who get Satchel of the Hunt. All allies within 12 yards, 30% movement speed. Actually, very nice, noticeable movement speed buff, 30%, quite a bit. You eat food much faster, which lets you get your mana back faster if you need to, if you're playing a particularly mana-hungry spec. And your auto attacks stun the target once every 30 seconds, 2-second stun. This has been nerfed since on PTR. On PTR, this is a nice long stun. Now that it's down to 2 seconds, usually this is just going to be messing with your group's stun DR for not too much benefit, although it does effectively give you an on-demand stun if you're a healer that doesn't normally auto-attack, right? And then you can use this to potentially carry your group through stuff by stunning important stuff. So consider that in that kind of situation. Otherwise, I would say Satchel of the Hunt, really nice to have access to in your group. Then finally, Executioner Verruth. For DPS players, there's another option of Champion's Brand. There's the Dagger of Necrotic Wounding, which actually does quite a bit of damage on single target. This thing is a huge source of extra damage on bosses. Can be something like 10% of your damage. It's 20 procs per minute, increased by haste, so haste-loving specs get even extra value out of this. And then there's Volcanic Plumage, which basically lets you spawn volcanoes under enemies. This will generally do less overall than either of the other two options, but it provides a ton of useful disruption, right? Anytime this is triggering and stopping something from casting its spell, there's all kinds of mobs this expansion that this is really, really valuable against. So I would say this choice is absolutely going to be based on what situation you're in, whether you need that AoE disruption, that single target damage, nice stat buff, all options I would consider. For tanks, you have Champion's Brand as well, or the Stygian King's Barbs, which actually represents a sizable chunk of damage. There's also Siegebreaker's Stand, which gives you theoretically quite a bit of damage, right? A 12% damage increase by standing still. But in Mythic Plus, standing still is often not something you actually get to do. You do get 10% armor upon reaching 3 stacks, but still, I would say that this one is something you will have pretty low uptime on unless you're specifically playing around it. There are some Soulbind trees that also encourage standing still, so maybe if you're playing one of those, that sort of thing is something you're already incentivized to do. But I would generally go with the Stygian King's Barbs here. And then finally, for healers, you have Champion's Brand, of course. Overflowing Chalice, which is a great way to get a little bit of extra mana back if you're on a spec that cares about that. And there's the Diamond Alembic, which lets you store healing while standing still. And then when you move, it can heal somebody. So also that standing still synergy. I would say the Overflowing Chalice here, generally the choice I would go with on any character that doesn't have their mana already fully sorted out. But your healer mileage may vary. Again, a great option is to check through the class guide for your spec and see what anima powers are suggested there and the reasoning behind it. Anyways, that's the way this affix works. TLDR, Stone Ward good. Champion's Brand pretty good. Crumbling Bulwark good. Aura's Cold Heart, all the powers for all the specs kind of suck. And then Executioner Verruth, DPS powers all exciting. Hard to choose. So good in different ways. Hope this video helped. Come check out my Twitch stream, twitch.tv/Dratnos. Thanks everybody for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye.